Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson at the Illinois State Water Survey, and you're here for Wellcare 101, What You Need to Know to Protect Your Family. It's a webinar, part of our monthly webinar series for the private well class. Let me get started here. So this webinar, as I mentioned, is part of a series we do once a month through our national program, the private well class. These materials sort of follow the class, or just a small piece of it, really. And we are recording this webinar, and it will be available on YouTube and through our webpage probably by the end of the week. And we will have time for questions. When you registered, you're able to put to list a question. We have many of those in our right in our PowerPoint today. And as we move through, if there's something that comes up, feel free to use the question or chat box on your GoToWebinar screen. Katie Hollenbeck is monitoring that and will be providing a list of those questions at the end that we can go through that are in addition to what we provide today. So I do want to mention the funding for this comes through RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. They're a national nonprofit that provides support to small communities for water, wastewater, housing, infrastructure, and also private well owners. And they have staff all around the country. And we're here from the University of Illinois through the Water Survey and the state, the Water Resources Center. So today it's, you've got three of us here on the line. I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the survey, and Katie Hollenbeck's here from the Water Resources Center. She's she will be taking your questions and is an outreach specialist. And Dan Webb is the head of our public service lab, which if you're familiar with the Illinois State Water Survey in Illinois, our public service lab does sampling for private well owners and the public here in Illinois. So hopefully between the three of us, we can answer all your questions today. One thing to point out, and what I always try to remind people of, private wells aren't regulated. So it's up to you as the owner and the user to be sure your water is safe to drink, and you have to maintain it on your own. You're basically like the operator of a very small water system. I personally grew up on an old hand-dug well, and now I live in Champaign-Urbana community. So now I use city water, our community water supply, and the $40 or $50 a month I pay actually goes into maintaining, sampling, providing the staff, and all the infrastructure so that when I open my kitchen tap, I've got water. But for you, as a well owner, that's completely your responsibility, and that's why it's important that you understand how your well works and all of those things. So, and the thing about well water, it can look clear, taste great, all those things, but a lot of times it's the water that doesn't taste great or has color to it that actually doesn't have any health problems. A lot of contaminants can be odorless, colorless, and have no taste. And so it's really important, and the take-home message will always be that you need to sample your well regularly just to have that peace of mind and be sure that your well is, it's providing water that's safe to drink. So things to consider with your well. We get a lot of questions about well depth. What's a shallow well? I think we talked about that today. In general, a deeper well is better if it's getting water from a deeper source, just because it means it's less likely to be influenced by the surface. That's not always the case. And in some cases, a deeper well may tap a geologic formation that has some naturally occurring contaminant like uranium or arsenic. And so in those cases, there may be it may not actually be better. It may be more mineralized, that sort of thing. Also, things to consider for your well is where you're at on the landscape, especially if you're in a shallow well. If you're, say, in a rural subdivision and your home is in the lowest one on the landscape, it's likely that the natural groundwater flow for the water table is down gradient, wherever the surface gradient is. And so if your neighbors have septic and some of those issues and everybody's on shallow wells, then that could have an influence on your well and water quality. So in the same way, their groundwater flow direction. If there's a way to know or talk to someone like at a state geological survey or in Illinois, the water survey, about flow direction in your aquifer, it gives you an idea of where your water's coming from, how deep it might be, and how far it's traveled before it actually gets into your well. So, and it just goes without saying the area surrounding your well. We find wells that are in the middle of cattle feedlots, in the middle of farm fields, or in the middle of a garden, and you want to keep your well away from any possible sources, even if it's properly constructed, just to be on the safe side. So those are all considerations. As far as if you have poor construction, the issue is a lot of well construction codes in states have changed, and now they're pretty good. There's a few states that don't have well construction code, namely Alaska and Pennsylvania, but everybody else in the country does. And but older wells have always been grandfathered in. So understanding how old your well is, whether it was drilled to the same code that's available today, maybe your well's in a pit or it's in a hand dug well, we run across a lot of those still. And they're a safety hazard. They're also a water quality hazard. Old hand dug wells typically are getting their water from the water table, which is direct infiltration from the surface. And so there's a lot more likelihood of surface contamination in those cases. Here's just some examples. The well on the upper left, this is a picture from the Washington State Department of Ecology's blog. They're the primacy agency in Washington State that governs well drillers' licenses and well construction code. And they show a lot of images like this where, in this case, there's an old piece of plywood over the well, and they've got a concrete block that's covering that hole. The well owner stepped over this one too many times, and the plywood gave way or broke, and she fell in and it killed her. And it's not the proper way to have your well. You can see it looks like old insulation laying around on the ground next to this funnel, and there's probably there's mice in there and all those sorts of things that can all get in your well. The picture on the upper left or upper right is this is a concrete tile at the surface, but down at about 5 feet is an old brick-lined hand-dug well. It's not in use anymore, thank goodness, but this is in southern Illinois, and there's a nearby goat farm, and a goat made its way over here and fell in. And so it's, these things happen. Kids fall in. There's a lot of issues like that. And the picture on the bottom is another hand-dug well that's actually still in use today. We actually sampled this well as part of a water quality project a number of years ago, but it's on a slope. There's a cornfield above it, and so drainage is coming down towards the well. You can see the mud on the right side, and these posts are all worn because it's in a pasture and cattle have been rubbing against it. And all they have covering this well is some 2x8s and 2x10s, some tin metal, and some concrete blocks to hold it down. That's not a safe way to have your well. Mice can get in there. Even squirrels or rabbits might be able to get into this well. And if they fall in, they're gonna die there. And we run across that a fair amount of the time, where an animal has been able to get into a well and they're just floating in the water, and the people are drinking this water. So, it's up to you to be a good steward of your well and protect your water quality, and that all starts with proper construction, or if it's not properly constructed, maybe then to upgrade the area around the surface where your well is so that it is protective of surface sources. So what do you do with these wells? You try to bring them up to code if you can. And, some things about well construction code are there for a reason, like states vary in what they require for the height of the well above ground surface. In some states it might be 12 or 6 or 18 inches. And if your well is 10 inches above ground surface and the code says 12, there's really no reason to spend the money to raise that by 2 inches. But if you're in a pit, it would be good practice to extend the well up to the surface, fill that pit in, install a pitless if needed, which means a pitless adapter, which allows you to have a sealed well at the surface. And then, as always, what we recommend, talk to a local well authority, county, health department, or a contractor beforehand and find out what they would recommend and, what the code is and how you can protect your well so that it's, it's protected from surface contamination. So the other big issue, and one of the things that occur a lot in rural areas, are abandoned wells. We see as many wells that we don't have logs for as what we do. So for instance, in Illinois, there was a law passed in 1968 that said you had to file a log with the county health department whenever a well was drilled, and it had to be drilled by a licensed contractor. When we go out, or I go out to do work in a rural area and try to find a well log for a well owner, I have about 50% luck, and that meaning that I find about half the well logs that are on file like they're supposed to be. The other half, we don't have a log for. The state doesn't. And so that means they're either older or a log wasn't filed, but there are many of these wells out there, and the much older wells, like the one that had the goat in it, that well's just been abandoned and not properly sealed for probably, 50 years. They may have put that piece of concrete tile there just to try to make it a little less of a hazard, but obviously it didn't work. And the right thing to do is to seal those up. So, and abandoned wells are a problem because, one, it's not in use. Depending on how deep it is, it could be a pathway into the aquifer. So that abandoned well could act as a source of contamination for your existing well. It's also a safety risk. If someone wanders onto your property and they fall in an abandoned well, they get hurt or it kills them, you're going to be on the hook and liable for that issue, right or wrong. It just makes sense that if you have an old well that's not being used, that you have it abandoned. And I know in many states there's actually a law that says you have so many days to actually abandon a well after it's not used anymore. And the problem is there's no enforcement of that, and so a lot of that never happens. So just some examples. Again, the two pictures are from Washington State Department of Ecology's blog, and one shows a horse that fell in an old well, and the other one there where the tripod is, there's a man down in the well. They're still trying to get him out. He was fortunate enough to live to talk about it, but he fell 45 feet into an old abandoned well. These newspaper clippings, all but the third one, are from Illinois. And one of the problems is each of these papers, the Galesburg paper, the Springfield paper at the bottom, and the second one, Buffalo Grove, is a Chicago suburb, these kind of stories make their local or regional paper. They don't make state headlines or national headlines, so people don't realize how much it happens. And the third one there, Jessica McClure, if you're old enough, everyone remembers when that was covered live on CNN for like 18 hours or so, when the little girl that was trapped in that well, and they were able to dig her out. So it brought some awareness to those issues, but again, this was in the 90s, and it still happens today. So as far as basic well care, in some states you can install your own well. In Illinois you can, as long as you follow this construction code. But it's like anything else. Are you going to build your own car? Are you going to, build your own house? In most cases, no, unless you have the wherewithal to do that. And the same way with a well. You can find the materials and some of those things, but using a licensed well driller or pump installer contractor to do those things just ensures that you have some insurance that it's going to be done right, that there's someone who you can contact if there's an issue. Otherwise, that part falls on you again. And, in some cases it may contaminate an aquifer or cause you not to have water, which in a rural area can really be a problem sometimes. So that's certainly one best practice we would recommend. There are guides, like this is from the Minnesota Department of Health, and you should, if you're going to drill your own well, or if you just want to know you're going to have a well drilled, I recommend you look this up for your state, contact someone. We can even help you find the rules for your state, if there are any, and get you the information so that you're in the know when your well's drilled. So, most drillers are very reputable. They want to do what's right for their customers, but you need to protect yourself as well. We find in some cases that well drillers don't give the well logs to the well owner once they've drilled a well. So if they don't get filed with the state for some reason, then there's no record. And so one of the things I recommend is that if you're going to have a well installed, you make sure it's part of your contract with the well driller that they provide you all of the drilling record as far as how it was drilled, the geology, what they installed, the types of materials they used, whether it was PVC or steel pipe, what kind of screen they used if they needed a screen, all of those things, so that down the road when you have an issue, if you have an issue, then you have some reference materials to work with to understand what might be the cause. And just simply knowing how deep your well is, it's amazing how many well owners don't know. And if there's no well log on file somewhere where they can look that up, or the driller doesn't exist anymore, or is retired, then, or if it's an older well and you don't even know who the driller is, then you're kind of out of luck. So we certainly recommend tracking all that information and keeping all of that somewhere where it's accessible to you. As far as the well itself, this is a properly constructed well. It's very clean. It looks pretty new. On that well cap, there is it's sealed and has a gasket. Sometimes rubber, usually a rubber gasket. Over time, especially if you're in an area that freezes, that gasket gets brittle and ends up not working anymore. One thing you hardly ever see is recommendations to replace that gasket, but it needs to be replaced, probably every 3 to 5 years or so that you're sure that's a watertight seal. And if it's a different type of cap that has a vent and a vent screen, that's where make sure the vent has a screen and it needs to be elevated, that there's nothing around it that might be a potential source. Now, if this well is properly constructed, it probably has the annulus is, so when you drill a well, let's say you're going to put in a 6-inch diameter well, the driller is likely to drill close to an 8-inch hole. And so the difference between the casing for the well and the hole is called the annulus. And that's usually sealed with grout. And grout is a bentonite or a clay type of liquid seal in most cases. And what that does is it protects the well by not letting things run down along the side of the well because of the borehole you've created that goes all the way down to the screen if it has one, or to the end of the casing. And so you put clay in there to seal that all up. And you want to check that and make sure that there's not, you can't look down the side of the well from the outside. If so, then it needs to have something, go back to your contractor, or, find out you need to have it sealed. You need to have clay put in there and make sure that your, around your wellhead is protected from things at the surface seeping in. And, it says wells should be accessible. I've seen people who have actually cut their well off at ground level because they wanted to put a garage in, and they put the concrete pad right over their well. That means that if there's ever any work that has to be done, or you have to get in the well for any reason, you can't. And not understanding some of those issues, sometimes people make decisions where the well's no longer accessible, so it may not be underneath your garage, but it could be in a spot that you can no longer get a truck up to the well. And if you have a submersible pump where you have to pull maybe the pitless adapter and the pump up from whatever depth it might be, if you can't get a drill rig or a service truck back to your well, then that's going to be really hard to do. So, common sense things, keep the site clear, and if you make sure that everything around the cap is still sealed. The best example looking at this PVC pipe I can give you is, I grew up on a farm. I was kind of crazy with our lawnmower, a riding lawnmower. If that well would have been in the middle of our yard, I guarantee I would have hit it a few times. And especially with PVC, if it's cold or if it's worn, it doesn't take much to put a crack in that PVC. And then once that happens, then there's a pathway into the well, especially for surface, liquids and what rainfall might help seep into the ground. And sometimes those cracks can occur just underground where you don't even see it. We ran into a case in Virginia where these people couldn't figure out why they kept getting bacteria hits on their well. And I was told, well, my well's in the middle of the yard. There's nothing around it. There's no reason for this at all. It's properly sealed. Then they sent me a picture, and there's about an 18-inch diameter tree about 2 feet from the well, and it's a PVC well like this one. Well, I can guarantee you what I told them they needed to do is get rid of the tree, and maybe even put a lining on the inside of the well, or at least have someone with a camera come in and look at the upper 6 or 8 feet, because in all likelihood a root had got around that casing, and as it grew, it cracked the casing, and now there's a pathway there for bacteria and things to get in the well. So when we say, it should be accessible and inspect for potential sources, really the best thing is to look just like this well, nothing around it, in an open spot. Sometimes people put things over top of it, like a wishing well type of decoration, that sort of thing is fine, but you shouldn't have any possible source or anything that could do damage to your well nearby. Again, from the Minnesota Department of Health, they've got a really great health department. They have an active groundwater and private well program and have staff all over their state who do a lot of this work. And one of the things that I use from them is this isolation setback distances. So by law in Minnesota, a new well can't be installed if it's any closer than these distances to one of these types of sources. And the reason I use this one is because they've really covered about every possible source you can think of. Some are, and in some cases, depending on the geology, these distances might not be enough. But at some point, the state has passed rules that are maybe, semi-protective, but things that you might want to take into consideration. Like if you're in a really sandy area, for instance, I would want my well further than 50 feet from my septic tank, depending on the direction of flow of groundwater in the shallow surface. But these are guides, and like I said, I show this particular diagram because a lot of things can affect your well that you might not even consider. And so I just want to show this list of all the things that are listed here. So really, even they show electric lines and tanks and things like that. Those don't seem like they would be any kind of risk, but at the same time, if you're looking at maintaining the well and maybe having a drill rig or a service truck over top of your well at some point, it needs to be in an open area, and that's part of the reason for this. So, you can find out what your state requires, if they, what they might require from your state health department, and or like in Washington State, it's the Department of Ecology. The folks that regulate well construction will have a list of these things. Quickly, a little bit about septic tanks. This is a typical septic tank that we're used to here in Illinois. On the left is the tank coming from pipe coming in from the house. The material comes in from your shower and toilet and sink and dishwasher and everywhere else. The tank's really like a settling basin, allows the solids to fall to the bottom, or maybe they float on top. But the bacteria in that tank then begin to work on that material and break it down. This is a 2-stage tank, so that it has a chance. It's got a baffle in the middle, so that a lot of the solids don't make it through to the second side, where they can get in and plug up the line that's going out to your drain field. And so once it leaves the tank, it goes to a junction box in some cases, where then it spreads out among a number of different pipes that make up your soil absorption field or your drain field, where that water can then percolate down into the ground, and bacteria in the soil and just natural processes can work on that and break it down and make it harmless. So when this doesn't function properly, you're adding too much to it, or the bugs get killed, or it's not working properly. You haven't pumped it in 10 or 12 years. What can happen is that can be full of solids. They can either clog your drain field or those pipes, so they won't work anymore. And in that case, as more material comes into your well, more liquids, it'll start coming out the top, and you'll notice that as either a wet spot where your tank is, or a really rich green grass for a while before it gets to that point, or if you have a basement with plumbing in the basement, like a half a bath or whatever, you might see it just coming back up through the toilet in the basement. And so we've seen all those things happen, and it's a matter of maintaining your system and keeping the solids, where they belong and at bay, so to speak, so that it doesn't disrupt the function of your tank. So as far as a to-do list for that, maintain the area around your tank. You should know where it's at. You should know where the access port is. there should be a way to inspect. There's a manhole for cleaning it out, but there's also an inspection port such that you can measure the amount of solids, and you might need a septic specialist to do that. Or if some people have the wherewithal to do that on their own, but once the tank starts to get full, it needs to be pumped of solids so that it can function properly and have volume so that it will work properly. The best thing you can do to maintain your septic system as far as things not to put in it necessarily, and also so that it lasts longer between pumping, if you will. You shouldn't have your sump pump or whirlpool or softener backwash go into the septic. You should have a separate line for those things to discharge, somewhere in your backyard or something like that. The more that goes in, the quicker it's going to run through the system. And part of the reason the bacteria are able to break things down is because they have time to actually do the breaking down. And if you have too much flow going through your septic system, that limits the amount of time to do that. So only put wastewater in your septic system. If you have a garbage disposal, the general rule of thumb is that halves the time between when you need to pump your septic. And obviously no man-made stuff, paints, pills, throwing the amoxicillin you didn't use when your child was sick down the toilet puts antibacteria material into your septic tank that works by having bacteria grow and break down the things coming from your house. So you don't want to do that. But as far as garbage disposals go, when you're putting those solids, eggshells and pieces of carrot or skin from potatoes or whatever, it's such a solid form that bacteria can't really break that down, and they end up being part of the solids mat at the bottom. And so if you do have a disposal, you need to really be careful and monitor your septic tank even more frequently. And it's actually not recommended to use a garbage disposal if you have a septic system. So I've mentioned these others already. Pumping on a regular schedule. If you look online, there are materials that say, there's 4 people in our house, our septic tank is 750 gallons. Here's in all likelihood how often we should pump our tank. And so you can go by those guides. There's people who will say that we haven't pumped our septic tank in 20 years and it just works fine. Their day is probably coming because it can't continue to work fine. Maybe it's a bigger tank than they thought, or there's only 2 people on it and it's just managed to work out. But eventually they're either going to plug up their distribution system for their drainage field, or their tank's going to fill up and they're going to have a problem in their backyard. As far as testing goes, this is actually a photo of a rural well owner where we're doing a pitcher study looking at some of their raw water and also the water from one of these filters that are on a pitcher. And so we're actually having them do both and collect 2 sets of bottles for us over time to see what the changes were. But it's important certainly to test your well annually for nitrate and coliform, and also any other time the well's been opened or you have some kind of noticeable change. And so when those things happen, it's an opportunity for, especially when your well's been opened, it's a chance for bacteria to get into your well, and it's best just to test for coliform to make sure that nothing happened. If you've had to have your pump fixed or a line changed or whatever. So what should you test for? I'm going to say this a number of times. Every situation is different, and it's really true. Every well is unique. They're in a unique groundwater system. They're at their own specific depth. They tap into different geologic units that may make different kinds of changes in water quality, and so you really need to understand your well. It could be very different from your neighbor's well that's only a couple hundred yards away, and that's the truth. So you need to understand how deep your well is, where the water's coming from, and if there are any known contaminants, naturally occurring contaminants in the area, as well as things like, if there was an old gas tank buried nearby and things like that. But natural contaminants like, arsenic or uranium can be an influence if they're in an area, and typically if there's a specific aquifer where we know there's arsenic, then typically many of those wells will have some arsenic in them if it's because it's part of the matrix of the aquifer material itself, if you will. So, and arsenic is, I believe, the 7th most common element in the Earth's crust, and so that means it exists in a lot of places. So when you want to find out about those things, you can, what you should always do is contact your county or state health department and ask for advice. If they know of any naturally occurring contaminants or any other issues in the area. If there is something, they'll probably know it. And, also, don't be afraid to ask your neighbors, your state well records folks, whoever that might be, or even a local driller or co-op extension. They all, depending on what their role is, co-op extension, there's, at least in Illinois, there's some extension folks who have made working with private well owners more of a priority than others, and so they may have more of a background, and they help out around the state when needed, instead of every co-op extension agent having the same level of skill, if you will. So it's about finding the right person who can help you with those decisions. And as I already mentioned, coliform bacteria and nitrate. I want to make it clear, coliform bacteria and really nitrate, unless it's related to babies or pregnant women, aren't harmful to an average person. It's E. coli that's the harmful bacteria, or other types of bacteria that can get in your well. The reason you sample for coliform and nitrate is because they're so available at the surface, and their sources are mostly surface sources, that they're good indicators that there's a pathway into your well, meaning that for some reason your well isn't properly sealed near the surface, or the aquifer you're using has a quick recharge from the surface where these things can get into the aquifer. And so the reason you're testing for those is to, if you don't have coliform or nitrate, you shouldn't have it every year. Every year you test, it should always be the same. And if you do have those things, something's changed. And it could mean that, there's a breach in your well, or that seal has gone bad and now critters are getting into your well from the surface. It could be as simple as the vent on the well cap, the screen is gone, and now, some sort of small animal or rodent has made its way into your well. And so that's why you need to inspect and check those things and sample. And really, sampling is your baseline of defense, just to ensure that your water's safe. And we talk a lot about it. People give private wells and groundwater a bad name in a lot of situations. In all honesty, if your well is properly constructed and you're checking it and all the sampling shows that it's fine, your water is as good and safe as any water from anywhere else. And millions of people use groundwater from private wells every day and have no issues. So, but it's just a matter of, again, going back to the community water supply situation, I have confidence that the drinking water in my home is safe because I know the city of Champaign-Urbana, or actually Illinois American, the company that runs our water system, is taking samples and making sure that the water they're putting in their distribution system has been tested and is safe. You just need to do the same thing. So a couple examples. There's also help from State Health Department, or here it's the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. They've got this website. You can type in your address. If you're on a bedrock well, it'll tell you if you're at risk of arsenic or uranium from your private well. And so they've done enough work around the state where they know which aquifers and what areas where those things are higher and might be an issue for the drinking water coming out of your well. And so they provided this service to the well owners in Massachusetts. There's a number of examples. This is just a still image on Rhode Island Department of Health's website. The little circles that are all over are actually where there used to be orchards. And in this case, these really old orchards all used arsenic, and a lot of it, to treat their orchards when they were in existence. And so a lot of these areas have contaminated groundwater with arsenic. And the big splotch in the middle, if you can see it, is beryllium. And I use this as an example every time because I've been in the groundwater and drinking water business for 30 years, and I didn't realize beryllium was a regulated contaminant, but it is. It's got an MCL, which is a maximum contaminant level allowed by law. So all the communities in Rhode Island have to make sure that the beryllium is below a certain level for their community water supplies. So as a private well owner, if you lived in this area, you'd want to sample for beryllium and make sure it's not too high, because it does have health effects. It's just not real common around the rest of the country, and so it's something I hadn't come up against before. But it just shows you why it's important to contact these agencies. They're on your side. They want to make sure that you're safe. The Department of Health in every state and county, their mission is to protect your health. They want to do what's best to help you, and so they can certainly provide you with resources and answers. There's also some of these nice mapping tools available. This is Wisconsin's. Their DNR in Wisconsin, the Department of Natural Resources, is the primacy agency that monitors water quality and sets all the rules for public drinking water systems and all the private well construction rules and those things. And so I went in here, and you can tell it if you look on the upper right, display arsenic. I could have said nitrate or a number of other things by county. And so it's showing me the data they have. The county up in the upper right that's yellow, that means in that county, the average arsenic value for the samples they have in that county, which this doesn't tell you how many that is, has been 11 to 15 parts per billion, which the health standard recommended by the US EPA and required for community water supplies is 10. And so once you've reached 10, if the communities in that county, if they have over 10 ppb of arsenic in their raw water, they have to treat it to remove enough arsenic that it's below 10. And so it's a good guide to use if you, especially if you're thinking about buying a house, or if you want to know if you live in Wisconsin, for instance, if there's things you should be concerned about, you can look through this list, and it's pretty helpful stuff. And taking it even a step further, the Department of Ecology in the state of Washington has actually put a lot of actual raw data up online. So all these blue dots are private wells, and you can look on any one and see what the water quality there is. So, it's pretty cool that they've got that information. There are issues with some of this, and some states don't do it. They don't have the data, or there are privacy issues the way their laws are in that state, because, this can affect property values and a lot of other things. But it's actually, in the long run, it's the best way to protect folks from either making a bad decision about where they purchase, or if they're buying a home, or at least if they have a home, they know what to test for. They can look and see what's happened around them and find out if there's, an arsenic issue or a nitrate issue, or, if this certain type of well, maybe you see several of these wells that have some kind of issue. So this is where things are heading, is that more and more of this information is going to be made available. And so it really is about, for instance, if you're thinking of selling your home, the best thing you can do for you and the person who's buying it is getting a complete water analysis and knowing what's going to happen up front. Because depending on where they get their loan, they may be required to have a sample that meets a certain criteria anyway. And so it's not like you can hide the fact that you've got arsenic over 10 ppb. If you do, you should want to know it. And then you can add treatment beforehand and show the potential buyers that you've done your due diligence and the system's in place. If I'm buying a home, what I tell every well owner is, it is buyer beware. Even if the county, in some areas, the county may only tell you you have to sample for arsenic or for nitrate and coliform to be considered, quote, safe, or to pass a test so that you can sell it. I would never buy a house where with a private well, that it only had nitrate and coliform sampling. I would sample for a lot of other things just to be sure that I'm not walking into something. And the best example I have happened here in Illinois. The county only required testing for nitrate and coliform. A person bought a home, and about 2 years later, they sampled their well on their own and found they had arsenic at 150 ppb, which is micrograms per liter, and that's, the standard is 10. So they were really upset, felt they'd been let down by their county and by the realtors who were involved. And, the best thing you can do is, take care of it yourself, and that's my recommendation. So what do we recommend? As I mentioned, coliform and nitrate annually, and again, that's just every time you sample, it should be negative, and the nitrate should be about the same. Maybe it's 3 or maybe it's 5 parts per million for arsen or for nitrate, but the standard is higher than that. And again, it's only a risk, really a risk for pregnant women and babies. And so, but it does indicate if there's a change, and it's a very cheap way for you to be sure that nothing has changed with, the surface of your well, if you will, the area around your wellhead. And then we also recommend sampling for this list that's here, and anything else that you might get advice from your local or state health department. So, out east, like in Massachusetts, where they have uranium issues, they may say, you may call your county health department or local health district, and they may say, yeah, we do have uranium problems here, so you might want to sample for that as well. Or it could be you're in an area where there may have been some other issues, man-made issues. Like I know in Rhode Island, they, at the sale of a property, they require testing now for MTBE, which is a gasoline additive, and that's just because there's been so much of that. There was so much of that made in that area that they know they have some of that contamination, so they just made it a state requirement at a property transfer. So what this does for you, one, it tells you, lead, sulfate, pH, fluoride. There's naturally occurring fluoride. Many community water supplies put fluoride in their water to help with dental issues, but in some cases, if it's too high, it's harmful to your body. And so there are areas where there's naturally occurring fluoride that can be well above what's recommended by the US EPA. So the one thing I usually say about this part is, if your iron is at a certain value and your pH is at a certain value, you sample 5 years later, they should be very close to the same. Groundwater doesn't change that readily or that much or that fast. So, we have a well that I measure that I installed back in the 90s, and we sample it about every 6 to 10 years, and it's got arsenic at a certain level, around 40, I believe. If I went out there today, it would be, between 35 and 45. It's not going to be 200, and it's not going to be less than 3. And so that's the same with many of these things. If your pH is usually 7.5, and you go out and 5 years later sample your well and the pH is 6, something's changed. Something's made that water different. And then you need to start looking at what might have caused that. Has anything happened? Has there been any changes nearby? Even an earthquake can make changes to the water quality in your well. So it's a good way to have information on immediate risks, like, if your lead's really high, or if had arsenic or one of those things, but it's also a way to kind of monitor what's happening with your groundwater over time. So this is what we would recommend. Where to get it analyzed? As it says here, every state accredits labs for sampling for community water supplies. They have to use a lab that their state primacy agency, which is the agency that oversees protecting the health of community water supply users, that they have to meet certain criteria. And so in general, I would always say use a state accredited lab. There are exceptions to that, especially university labs. I know, for instance, the lab, Dan Webb, who's here on the call, runs our public service lab. 20 years ago, we were an EPA certified lab, but then the rules changed and it became not cost effective for us to maintain that certification, and so we dropped it. And even though we still follow all the same methods and same procedures and do duplicates and blanks and all the things that are required of an accredited lab, we don't have that, that symbol, if you will. And so there are a few of those labs around the country. Virginia Tech has one, Texas A&M, to name two others, and here at the University of Illinois at the State Water Survey. And so, I personally would hold our lab up to any kind of scrutiny that a certified lab would have. But again, what we recommend to people in general is that you should use an accredited lab, just so that there is that peace of mind and you're sure they met certain water quality or quality standards in how they do their work. So when you contact the lab, they should give you all the information you need. They can send you bottles. If you need to preserve them, which doesn't happen much anymore, because they don't want to be sending acid around in bottles anymore. But how to store it, how soon it needs to be returned, and if you're not sure, ask. And if they can't answer your questions, I'd find a different lab. And we tell labs this, that what we tell well owners is if you can't answer their questions, they should find somebody else, because they really should have that wherewithal to help you and give you the answers you need. So, a good lab's going to provide the bottles and everything else, instructions on how to collect it, and there's certainly plenty of those out there. So that's what we recommend in that respect. So interpreting the results, I know some people want to use a private lab so they can keep their results confidential, and I understand that. But, unless you're in an area, which there are just very few counties around the country where a county health department has the authority to actually not let you drink your water. In 99% of the country, if you have high arsenic and want to keep drinking your water, that's your business. And they certainly will recommend that you don't, because their job is to try to protect your health. But those same folks will interpret your results for you, tell you what it means, and give you advice, maybe even, or at least find advice for you on treatment if it's needed, all that sort of stuff. So there are websites out there where you can actually put in your test results, and it will spit out, whether this is a risk or not and for what for. But even if you're going to use those, which I'm going to show you one, take your results to the health department and have them give you a qualified answer. They're the health professionals. That's who should be looking at your results to tell you if it's safe or not safe, or what you might need to consider doing. So, and what we always recommend is if you do find something in your well, just resample it. It might cost you a little more money, but sometimes labs make mistakes. And, I'd be sure, for instance, with arsenic, there's certain aquifers where we know in Illinois there's likely to be arsenic, and there's certain areas in Illinois where we know it's very unlikely that there's going to be arsenic. And so if a high arsenic result happened in one of those areas where there shouldn't be, we would want them to resample just to confirm, because maybe bottles got mixed up, or there's a million reasons. It just wouldn't be typical to have that happen, at least for that constituent. So, if you do have bacteria, if you've done a coliform test, then I'd have it tested for E. coli. And until you've done that, you should boil your water until you can disinfect your well, chlorinate your well, or you need to chlorinate your well if you had bacteria until you figure out what you're going to do long term. So this is the tool I wanted to mention. This is actually from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, which is the state agency in New Hampshire that deals with groundwater and private wells and well construction. And so they did this in cooperation with CDC. So it's not some third party or any of that sort of thing. It's a state agency that's trying to protect the health of residents in New Hampshire. And so, that gives it some legitimacy. And it's a step above what's been available before, because not only can you put in your sampling results, but it'll tell you if it's above some health risk, but it also tells you what options you might have for treatment. And so it's a really informative tool. And again, as they say here, this is for informational purposes, and it should not be substituted for direct consultation with a qualified water treatment or public health professional. And I certainly want to reiterate that. You should have somebody put a set of eyes on your sample results and not rely on a website. So just for fun, I threw in 15 micrograms per liter, which the other advantage of this particular tool is that it asks you to put the units in. And in a lot of cases, all the units are the same and you have to convert. And so if this said, please list your results in milligrams per liter, what we found is many well owners, like many of the rest of us, have trouble with converting that math. And so 15 micrograms per liter, is 0.015 milligrams per liter. So if you accidentally put in 15 and it wanted milligrams per liter, now you're looking at 15,000, which is, off the chart, so to speak. So having this way is pretty handy. It allows you to go in and put it in the units that the lab gave them to you, and it lists all four here: milligrams per liter, micrograms per liter, parts per million, which is the same as milligrams per liter, and parts per billion, which is the same as micrograms per liter. So you can type in all this stuff. I just put in 15 because we know that 15 is above the health value. And so, as it says here, the drinking water contaminant limit is 0.01 milligrams per liter. 15 micrograms per liter is 0.015 milligrams per liter. And so it exceeds the drinking water standard. So what's that mean? Well, there are no enforceable standards for private wells, which means if I live here in Illinois and I have arsenic at 15 micrograms per liter, it's over the limit that the state says a community water supply can provide to their customers. But as a private well owner, if I want to drink that water, I have every right in the world to do so. So, that's what that means, basically. So you're on your own to do something about this. And then it recommends treatment. The most likely would be point of use, which is a POU unit, either an RO system or reverse osmosis, or an absorptive media filter system. So usually those are granulated activated carbon, and we know those work really well, like at a kitchen tap. The GAC filters that I know became a big deal recently because of what happened in Flint, Michigan with lead. Those work really well on lead, as well as some other things. And so you need to read the directions and read up front what it's supposed to take out and what it's been certified to take out before you buy any of that kind of equipment if you're going to. And because a lot of times, you need to make sure it's taking out what you need and not you're getting one just because, and it's actually not taking out, maybe it's taking out something that's totally benign. Like I said, you just need to make sure you're getting what you want out of this. And you should only add treatment if you need to, really, unless there's other issues. Like sometimes a GAC filter is really good just because the water has a funny taste, and it does a good job of cleaning that up. So then as you go down this page, it tells you more, does my water meet the drinking water standard? And I won't go any further here. And then if we went further down the page, it would give you an opportunity to tell you if I'd entered some of these other constituents like chloride, copper, or fluoride, it would have told me what the standard was and where I sat versus those things as well. So it's really a good site. It's called the Be Well Informed tool, and you can just Google that and find it on New Hampshire's webpage. So, as I've said several times already, these tools are really only for a guide, and they're for typical waters. We've certainly ran across water chemistry that's different than you'd expect, and some of these things don't hold out. Like there's a certain groundwater aquifer here in Illinois where conventional treatment for arsenic doesn't seem to remove the arsenic. That's because of some of the other constituents in the water. And so, those things do happen. And, Mother Nature's not easy and oftentimes very complicated. And so that's why you need to work with a health professional, either through your local health district or county health department to, make sure your water's safe. So, and as I said here, they can't tell you to stop drinking it or condemn your well, but they can only recommend it. And that's, I want to put a caveat there that that's mostly true. There are a few local health districts out east, one in Massachusetts particularly, where they can condemn your well. And if they feel like there's a health risk to your family, they will. But that's because they have the local jurisdiction there has, more power, if you will, or more rights at those things. And, it's a good thing to find out for yourself what the rules are in your jurisdiction where you live. So for basic well care, I just threw up two kinds of treatment here. How RO works, and a water softener shown here. Before you add any kind of treatment, if you're going to add treatment or if you already have treatment, the main issue in a lot of cases is that these things stop working if they're not maintained. So if they have a filter and you don't replace it, if they need to be back flushed and you don't do those things, whatever it might be, they come along with a maintenance schedule or a replacement schedule. And I actually had one of the regional engineers for one of the state health departments tell us that he would prefer we don't even include issues related to treatment in our private well class, because in his experience, those treatment devices become the source of contamination because they're not maintained. They think they're safe and they're not. and sometimes even some of those filters and things can harbor bacteria if left in too long. So, if you're going to add a filter, even if it's just, a 5 micron solids filter or whatever, you need to commit to doing the maintenance and replacement of, what needs replaced, following the timeline they give you, or it could end up being causing a health problem. Okay, so that's what I have today, and so the rest of the time we're going to spend going through questions we've received from you all, and we won't get to all of them, but actually we're going to get to a lot of them today. I've also left a couple in that make good points that got asked from our last webinar, actually, just because I think they're good things to mention. We are still working on our FAQ webpage. It's done. It just hasn't been made live yet. But all of these questions will end up there so that you can search through those on your own if you're looking for answers to specific questions. And if you haven't yet and you have questions for us, Katie can take those questions again to either the question box or the chat box, and we'll look at them at the end. And I'm not sure where that stands, so I'm going to look real quick. Well, let's just get to these first. So where to sample and why? When is it best to collect a water sample from a faucet in the house, and when is it best to sample at or near the well? So what our lab does, and Dan can expound on this if he likes, they usually talk to the well owners first. So they call us and say they'd like to get a water sample, and our lab samples for inorganics and metals. And he'll ask some questions about their well, if they have treatment, all those things. And so assuming they do have some kind of treatment, he usually sends them 2 sets of bottles so they can collect one that's from like an outside spigot or near the well where it's before any kind of treatment, and that would be more representative of the groundwater quality, and then one at the kitchen tap that's after all the treatment. That would be more indicative of their drinking water quality after it's been through a softener or a filter or RO or whatever. So it's really, it's amazing how different the chemistry can be. And so, yeah, I'm just going to show you an example. So we certainly recommend doing both so you understand if there could be issues that are related to something besides your well versus, in your plumbing, for instance, versus it's actually your natural groundwater quality, and that's just what you, then you know what to treat for as well. So here's a sample from 2015, and the things I'll note here are the sodium is at 25.9, the pH is 8.02, and you can see the turbidity and color in the right column halfway down show 29.8 and 48.1. The hardness is at 351. It's fairly hard water. It's groundwater from a well that's 200 and some odd feet deep. And then this is the raw water sample from an outside spigot. So this is representative of the groundwater that's coming out of the well. So then this person has a filter and a softener, and so you can see what that did. So what's interesting here is going down to the bottom right side, the hardness has dropped from 351 to 0.68. So the softener is working like it's supposed to, right? But an unintended consequence of using a softener with salt is if you look at the sodium, it went from, I think it was around 26 or 28, let me go back, 25.9, and now it's 198. So if you happen to be on a low sodium diet, understanding that your softener may be contributing that much sodium to your diet is probably important to know. They make other kinds of salt that are not sodium-based, that are KCl, potassium-based, I think, and they're more expensive, but if you're that person, it may be worth your while. And you can also see here the color and turbidity have gone way down, and that's partly because of the filter, the 5 micron filter he has on his system. And then after that, there's an RO unit, and you can see here all the minus signs, or the less than signs, mean it was below detection limit. So an RO unit basically takes almost everything out. There's certain things it certainly doesn't, like boron, and the sodium went from 198 down to 6, which is pretty low, lower than natural groundwater. But the one thing to note here is the pH changed from 8.1 down to 6.23. So by taking all that stuff out, you've changed the chemistry of the water such that the pH is now, a little acidic instead of basic like it was before. And that could have an effect on, a number of things. Now, right at the kitchen tap, it isn't going to affect much. But if you had, for some reason, you had a whole house system, which isn't typical, then you're running lower pH water through your entire plumbing system, then that may make a difference. So, this example is really just to show you that your water chemistry does change, and what you're drinking out of your tap, if you have any kind of treatment, probably isn't the same as what's coming out of the ground. So, Dan, this question is really for you. Could you explain how a softener that uses salt works?
Sure. Steve has a good slide here. It's the primary components of a softener: this resin tank, a brine tank, and salt. A lot of times you'll find a softener, it'll all just be one cylinder, one unit with the resin tank and the brine tank combined. They could just as easily be separated. So what's going on with the softener is that your most groundwater has a lot of hardness in it, and that hardness is composed of primarily calcium, magnesium, and so they designed this resin that has an affinity for calcium, magnesium. So when you run it through the resin in a normal operation mode, it's exchanging, it's called an ion exchange resin, so it exchanges out the calcium, magnesium. It removes those and it adds sodium in their place. The counter ions like the alkalinity and the chlorides and sulfates, they don't change. So when you think of a softener that's using salt, it's not really adding sodium chloride salt to the water. It's adding sodium alone to the water and taking out some other things, the calcium, magnesium, and the softeners will also take out some other elements if they're attracted to the resin, strontium, manganese, iron, barium, some other things like that. So when you soften the water, it goes through this normal phase, but after you use it for a while, you have to what's called regenerate it. You have to regenerate the resin so that you put sodium back on it. So that's where you go through these phases. It'll first run a backwash cycle that'll kind of push any sediment off the top of the resin, and then it will it's called a brine draw. It'll pull the very concentrated sodium chloride solution through, and that equilibrium pushes off the calcium, magnesium, and that's the primary regeneration process. And then it'll rinse all that extra salt water out to waste before it puts the softener back in line with your normal water use.
Great, thanks, Dan. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I also included, this is a sample from 1992, so it's kind of older data. But the point here is this sample is collected from the softener right before regeneration. So when all the media, resin or whatever is mostly spent, and so you can see here the sodium's at 36.6 and the magnesium and where those things are. And then the second sample is right after regeneration, and you can see what's happening. So your softener does lose capacity, if you will, as over time, and it needs to be regenerated. So it really can make a difference, which I think this is a great example to show what that's doing. So, and you can see here on the bottom, the water survey used to be an EPA certified lab, as I mentioned. So, okay.
And hey, Steve, can I mention one other thing?
Oh, sure. Let me go back.
No, it's a good point just to reinforce some of what you said earlier. Take care of do the maintenance and like you're supposed to do. Every once in a while, we'll run into somebody who, most people who have softeners know how they operate and know what to do, but sometimes people will, they'll be unaware they have a softener or something like that, and definitely, if you don't put new salt in your softener, there's no point in it. So it'll lose capacity within a week probably.
Okay, this is your question too, Dan.
Alrighty. So what, if anything, do you recommend private well users do about manganese in well water? Well, what I usually see happen is manganese is treated similar to iron. Both are from rocks and minerals underground, and they start off in a dissolved state, but when they get pumped up and exposed to oxygen, they can oxidize and precipitate out. The metal is changing to a different oxidation state. When it does that, they can cause staining. And there are some what's called secondary maximum contaminant levels that the EPA sets for aesthetic reasons. So often people will want to remove those because they cause this staining. What we see is a lot of people will use softeners to soften their water, and that the softeners also take out a fairly good amount of iron and manganese. Most of the time they take it all out. That relies on those being in a dissolved form and not the oxidized form. So what can happen is that the iron and manganese can oxidize, and if it oxidizes, it can be this precipitated form. It can foul the resin or build a coating on the resin. So you'll want to remove any oxidized form ahead of time. I would recommend a simple sediment filter. They're easy to install. You have to break through your plumbing, but they're fairly cheap to maintain. Just a string wound cartridge. I use a 5-micron filter. It's also good to remove any other suspended material that might be pumping up from your well. We have sand, a lot of grit in some wells. If you do have, or if you're looking for a softener, it's a good idea to look for one, ask your dealer for one that specifically can handle a lot of iron and manganese. If manganese is your primary target, you could still ask them about the high iron because it's probably going to be a very similar thing. If your iron is so high, they might say, hey, you have, say, over 10 parts per million of iron, or I don't know what the threshold would be for manganese. They might recommend adding an oxidizing filter or some other, what they might just call it an iron filter or a green sand filter, or they might have like a holding tank where they add some chlorine or some other type of oxidation, and then that filter will also filter out the precipitated iron or manganese. But if it were me, I would start off with a softener and try to do it that way because it's one less item that you have to maintain.
Yeah, and manganese doesn't have any, I mean, it's a secondary contaminant, right? Doesn't have any health effects.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I generally go by the EPA recommendations, right, and it's listed as secondary contaminant, so not really for health reasons.
Right. Okay. Oh, why didn't that work? Go ahead. This is you too, Dan.
Okay. There was a question about the mail-in laboratory services for private well owners. Some of the mail-in labs have certification in most areas of the U.S., and they tend to be lower cost. It seems like a good suggestion. I don't have a lot of experience with all the different labs that might do this kind of testing, but it seems like if it's a trustworthy laboratory, like a certified lab or like a government lab, or you've used them before and you know you have good experiences with them, it should be fine. My suspicion is that a lot of labs do take mail-in samples, so I wouldn't think that would be something to shy away from. You might ask questions about items that have short holding times. I think you'll find that health departments and any labs, for bacteria, they're going to only accept samples on, say, a Monday, Tuesday, or a Wednesday. They might avoid the end of the week so that they can get their analysis done within the holding time. But there are usually options. You can ship something overnight. Basically, just check with your lab if they have issues with that and how they would handle it. Another good point to make here is that look for the method that's, if it's cheaper because of the method they're using, they might be certified, or they might have a standard method that's regular expense, and then some cheaper method. I would make sure you use the standard method as opposed to something really cheap like a dipstick or a quick colorimetric test as opposed to an instrument. I would stick with the regular certified or traditional method if you can.
Yeah, and the bottom line is, if they're a certified lab, then they're, in all likelihood, it's a safe bet. right?
Yeah, I would think so. I would think they wouldn't be certified and then give you the offhand cheap analysis. I would hope not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so is it okay to drink water from a shallow well? Well, and like I said, I'm going to say this several times, it really depends on your situation. So, a shallow well can mean a lot of things, and it's different to different people. Is it shallow because the aquifer's shallow? Is it shallow because it's a hand-dug well? How is it constructed? How much casing does it have? Because you can have a well that's 300 feet deep, but it only has 12 feet of casing if it's in bedrock. And, that well's as much at risk, if not more, than a well that's only 30 feet deep, but it's got casing down to 25 feet and then 5 feet of screen. So it really depends on the situation and the geology. So, do we know that where your water's coming from in your well, is it susceptible to the surface? So is it a shallow sand? It varies along some river valleys where all the wells are less than 30 feet deep, and it's all sandy soil from the surface on down. If it's an agricultural area, then I would think that there's a real risk for pesticide and nitrate contamination, it really depends. If it's, I said water table here, I meant a dug or bored well that uses the water table for its water supply. And then how's it constructed? Is it, does it meet current code? Is it a really old well? Is it in a pit? It just, like I said, you can have a 30-foot well that's perfectly safe, and you can have a 100-foot well that's completely not safe. So it isn't as much necessarily, the one thing I'll say is, if it's a shallower well, then you need to probably test more often. And the closer to the surface you are, the more likely that it's surface water influenced, just because of the water's coming from close to the surface to begin with. So, but as I said here at the bottom, many shallow wells are perfectly fine. They're safe. They have good water quality. And, there are deep wells that have very little casing where it's bedrock and there are fractures going up to the surface, or it's karst topography. There's sinkholes, there can just be a lot of different types of influences. You need to understand the situation your well's in. And that's not a perfect answer, but that's a really open-ended question. So, and if you want to discuss that more, the person that asked this question, just email me or email. You'll get a reminder tomorrow about thank you for attending this webinar, and that if you respond to that, it'll come right to me, and I'd be glad to talk to you about it further. And so just let me know. So well disinfection. There's always a number of questions about disinfecting a well, and so I just use this one about, if I shouldn't add chlorine bleach to my well each spring, then how do I sanitize our well? Well, actually, you should only disinfect your well if you need to. And if you test every year for coliform nitrate and you never have any bacteria, then you don't need to do any kind of disinfection. In fact, if you're pouring bleach down your well, it can damage the rubber seals on your pitless or on your connections for your drop pipe. It can be harmful to the well components because it's too concentrated. And so, dropping bleach into your well is not the right answer. And, I've ran across a number of well owners who said their driller told them to do that. And that's unfortunate because the driller needs to be educated about that too. And, the right thing is to sample. And if you sample your well and you have bacteria, then you need to disinfect it. And there is no preventative chlorine bleach every spring. That doesn't prevent anything. If you have an opening in your well that allows bacteria to get in, even if you use chlorine and disinfect it, unless you do something to get rid of that pathway into your well, you'll have bacteria again a month later. And that's, that's one of the questions really here in the next question, I think. Because if there's a pathway in, groundwater is always moving. So the groundwater that's going into your well today or you're pulling from your well today is coming from somewhere else tomorrow, away from your well towards your well. And so that water wasn't chlorinated. And so it doesn't take long, and, what you did to disinfect your well doesn't have any bearing anymore. So it's a matter of your well being protected, and then you should test it. And if you do have problems, then you should disinfect it. And if you have continual problems, then that means there's a pathway into your well, like the example I mentioned earlier about the tree next to the well in Virginia. You know, they can treat it and disinfect it as much as they want, but you know, there's a lot of bugs that stay around tree roots. By bacteria type bugs. And so if there's a breach in the well and those tree roots are still there and alive, they're going to continue to get bacteria in their well after so many days after disinfecting it. It's just the way it's going to be, and probably after a rainstorm. So the right solution is, in those cases, like the tree root problem, is to get rid of the tree and fix the crack in the casing, and then make sure your well's sealed properly so that nothing could get in, and then you should not see that problem anymore. I do want to mention that the Minnesota Department of Health has I must have looked through 70 or 80 different guides on how to disinfect your well, and I had to pick one that I wanted to recommend to everybody nationwide, and this is the one I chose. It's from Minnesota Department of Health. It's their well and water system disinfection for private wells, and the reason is because it's a step-by-step guide, has pictures and examples. It tells you how to dilute the bleach so that you're not putting too much in at too high of a rate that it's going to damage your pump components, and it walks you through it step by step. And so, it's depending on the diameter of your well, how deep it is, how much you need to add, and then you mix it with water so that in the end, in a bucket before you actually put it in the well, so that you're not mixing it at too high a concentration. And then it walks you through what to do all the way down to, at the end, if you have, no one ever asks, well, what about my softener or my RO unit? Can they, when I do this, what's the chlorine going to do to them? Well, it walks you through what to do, and the WQA is a Water Quality Association, and like for a softener, it's saying you should probably bypass it or put it on bypass if it has that feature, so that it's not interfering with those with that equipment. So it's a really good guide, and I'm going to go back. If you go to our webpage, the privatewellclass.org, and look under our resources, under Lesson 10, one of the resources says Water Treatment Solutions, and it's listed there, this particular document, and you can download it as a PDF, and that's what we certainly would recommend. Okay. There's always questions about lead these days, and the pH is and low pH makes water more corrosive. Well, that's mostly true. There are situations where high pH can cause problems, and that's a huge issue to deal with to answer a question. And so I just want to point out that we did a webinar just on lead back on August 30th last year, and we have set up. There's a web page that we have set up that gives you a lot of resources you can download and look at or go to, and that's on the right side here. It's just privatewellclass.org/lead, and then if you go to our videos page, you can watch the entire 90-minute webinar on lead and the questions we answered. We used resources from EPA and from Virginia Tech, and from Dan, I think, from our lab too, where they've done some lead research and things that we have. And so it's, I recommend going there, and if you have questions after that, then you should contact us, because it's a huge issue. In a lot of cases, there's nothing to worry about. If your water's not corrosive, it doesn't matter if you have lead pipes or not, right? They form scale. So water either causes corrosion or it causes scale to form. And on a lot of natural groundwaters that aren't corrosive, these lead pipes have a scale layer built on to the inside of them over time that, it doesn't matter what the materials they're made of. So it's only if there's a change or if your water's corrosive that you need to worry about some of those issues. Someone said, we have a pump that is set in a flowing spring, and how can I be sure to keep it safe and free from contamination? So, most of the springs that I've ever dealt with are coming out of rock or coming out of the surface along a steep incline, and either along a river valley or the rocks along, say, the Illinois or the Mississippi rivers and those sorts of things. So many of those geologies are very vulnerable to surface contamination. It's either karst, where there's sinkholes and there's a lot of surface influence, or it's just the rock's close enough to the surface. It's obviously outcropped if you're having a spring there, that the fractures in the rock are influenced by any kind of surface contamination. So in general, most of the time if you have a spring, you need to have a continuous disinfection system. And that means either chlorine or UV, a continuous chlorinator pump, or a UV system, which they make nowadays for private wells. There's a lot of them, like in Tennessee and Kentucky, where they have that same issue, where it's a lot of springs out in rural areas, and so and that's the only way really to prevent that bacterial contamination of your water supply, because it's susceptible. And if your pump's sitting in a spring that's open to the surface, or traditional springs, they have you build a slurry wall around it, and you can build a tank in the ground that the spring can go into, and then you can pump from there. I don't have resources for that, but I can get you, I know the Pennsylvania Guide to Private Water Systems that their extension put out has a really good section on best practices for springs, and I meant to include that link here and I forgot. But if you contact us, we can send that link to you. It's just a PDF, and they talk about what the best practices are, because in a lot of times you'll see a spring where there's just a piece of PVC jammed into the crack in the rock, and that's where their water's coming in and it's flowing, and that's not ideal. You want to have a way to treat the water, because it is a surface water supply. It'd be like drinking out of a lake or a pond. Communities that use lakes or rivers for their water supply have to treat it like surface water, so they have to disinfect. So they're making sure they're getting rid of bacteria, and it's 4-log disinfection, and I'm not up on those rules for community water supplies, but it's for everything, viruses and all that stuff, so that there's some assurance that anything that might be in a surface water supply isn't getting into the drinking water supply. So they're just more of a risk. So you have to treat it like a city would treat a water supply, and that's really the only drawback, is that you're better off with continuous treatment. So someone also, we had two questions about how long does a pump last. A submersible pump in a well was the other question, I think. And so last year, Katie had contacted a number of drillers. We were trying to get an estimate of a number of things. So she asked them a couple different questions, and they varied all over the map. One of them was about how much a well costs, and I didn't include that here. But as far as how long the pumps last, you can see the different answers we got. We saw as few as 7 years and as much as 60 years. And, every driller is going to be different, and Katie picked a random driller in each of these states. And I think there's one or two other states that provided an answer for some of the other questions we had, but not for this one. Because I know Washington State answered some of these questions too. But, in general, if it's normal use and you're not in a situation where your pump might end up where the water level may drop below the pump if you're pumping it too hard, where your pump can get hot and some of those things, if it's especially a submersible pump is cooled by the water in the well, and so if the water drops below it and it turns on, it could burn up the pump. And so as long as all those things are the way they should be as far as being maintained, then it should last. Could last as much as 30 or 40 years. I know one of my friends who has a private well, he just replaced his pump, and I believe it was over 40 years old. And Dan, didn't you have to replace yours as well?
Yeah, I had a pump that I had to replace. It was like over 30, I think. It could have been closer to 40. I have to go back and check my my well logs, and as Steve had mentioned earlier, but yeah, I just replaced mine.
Yeah, so I probably forgot to mention, it's having someone who samples private wells for a living who also lives on a private well and understands all those issues is pretty beneficial to us, all of us actually. And so some of the things Dan's went through with his well certainly end up in our class, or like for answering questions like this. So, you know, yeah.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. All right. So we had another question here. I think this might be the last one. Would drilling an existing well deeper decrease the likelihood of the well running dry or containing excessive iron? Well, and I'm assuming since your well has got excessive iron that it's already a drilled well that's in an aquifer that's buried, not a dug or bored well that's in a superficial aquifer situation. Because typically you wouldn't see a lot of iron in like a water table well or a really shallow well that's the aquifer is all the way to the surface. So, drilling a well deeper, you can have differences in water quality in the same aquifer at different depths. So, for instance, nitrate's a good example. In a sandy aquifer, sometimes you see more nitrate in the upper third of that aquifer than in the bottom third, depending on how thick it is. So we have an aquifer that I'm basically talking about here is in central Illinois, and it's over 100 feet thick and has 100 feet of water in it. And because it's sandy soil at the surface, some of the agricultural production has caused some higher nitrates, but we see some of the deeper wells there being much lower in nitrates. So that doesn't answer your question about the iron. Unfortunately, it's pretty hard to find a deeper aquifer anywhere that doesn't have a significant amount of iron in it. And I'm sure there are, but in general, that's one of the things that you can expect to find in groundwater. It's fairly high iron. I mean, it's highly mineralized water, and so it's, most of the time it's not going to help. Not to say that it won't be different, but yeah, as far as the iron goes, you're likely to run into some iron, no matter whether you drill down into a deeper aquifer or whatever. And to that point, we have places where you can drill through, say there's a sand and gravel at 80 feet to 100 feet, and it's full of water. That can be one water quality. Then there could be a clay layer beneath that, say from 100 to 150, and then another sand from 150 to 250, and that can have a little bit different water quality. And then you have bedrock, and you could drill down maybe as much as 1,000 feet and run across two more aquifers. One's a sandstone, one's a dolomite. So every one of those might have different qualities. And, depending on your situation, you're likely not going to drill through all of those and try to get water from all four. You're going to pick one based on whatever criteria there's a reason for that. So as far as your well running dry, if you're in an area where it's just known that the amount of water available is really low, so the entire aquifer, say it's a bedrock well, and it's considered a very low-yielding aquifer, there are significant areas where that's the case. And you may have a well that's 600 feet deep, and you can only pump half a gallon a minute. And so in those cases, a lot of times you add more storage, either a bigger pressure tank or several holding tanks before the pressure tank, so that your pump can pump almost continuously to keep water in that system, even when you're sleeping, it's refilling all that stuff up. And so if it's a bedrock well, the one thing I can tell you is typically most of the fractures and the most amount of fracturing is near the top of the unit. And so when you get into that unit, that bedrock, and the further you go down, the less likely you are to hit a big fracture or a more significant water supply. So I've given you a couple examples. It really depends on your situation and exactly what you're doing. I know we've certainly seen cases where somebody might have a old hand dug or bored well that's 40 feet deep, and now it's dry all the time, and they've had a driller come in and set over that 3-foot diameter hole and punch a 6-inch or an 8-inch hole through the bottom of it and go down 150 feet and hit an aquifer. That's not really the same thing, trying to make your well deeper. It's really tapping a different unit, and you're just taking advantage of the 40 feet you've already went through. So, this is a tough question to actually analyze in general, So if you want to contact us, we can look at your situation and try to get you some better information for that. Okay, so quickly, more on the private well class. If you haven't taken the private well class, it's a set of 10 lessons that come to you through your email, and you sign up at privatewellclass.org. It's much more extensive than what we went through today. It really gives you a good overview of how water gets in your well, well types, treatment, all those issues, where to find local help, all that sort of stuff. So on our homepage, you click on Learn by Email. It takes you to this page. It just needs an email address, your first name, and what state you live in, and then you click the box for class instruction every 7 days. And it'll start sending you one lesson a week. It's a PDF. It's self-taught. You're on your own. You can ask questions of us at the end by emailing us, all that sort of stuff. But it's really meant to be something you can use to understand your well better. Here's the Learn by Email tab on the bottom left. This is the front page of our website, and it's just privatewellclass.org. In addition to that, I mentioned like that disinfection guide I mentioned is in lesson 10, and this is lessons 1 and 2. If you go to our resource library, and all of these documents are free and publicly available to download, and they give you more information about what's in each of those chapters, if you will. So lesson 1 is called The Science of Groundwater, and here's more resources you can look at besides the 8 or 10 pages that we provided on how that all works. What we're doing today is another webinar that'll look just like this when Katie gets it up online. So after the August 30th webinar, we recorded it. She cleaned it up a little bit and then put it here on our videos page. And if you just go to our videos button at the bottom of the front page, it'll take you to this page where it lists 2 different categories, training videos and webinar recordings. And you can find any of these webinars that we've already done. And this is one of the short videos. We have a series of, I believe, 16 right now, short videos on how it's a specific topic. How does my private well system work? What is a bored well? What do I do after a fire, like forest fire? How does my pressure tank work? And so these are 3 to 5 minutes long. Almost all of them are in that range, and they just give you a quick basic overview of a particular topic. And I will say one thing we've learned from this, about a year ago, a little over a year ago, we put up a video that says, it's called How Does My Pressure Tank Work? And it's had 67,000 hits in a little over a year. So that tells us a lot of people are interested in learning more about their pressure tank and don't understand how it works, or think that's the reason why their well system might not be working properly. Probably comes to down to water pressure issues, and that there's not a lot of other information out there. And so, yeah, it's pretty useful stuff. And in the end, our goal, we're funded by the US EPA through RCAP, and so everything's free, which is great for well owners around the country that we can provide everything that way. And so, our target, if you will, is to teach you as a well owner why it's important, why you need to understand how it works so that you can protect yourself and your family from risk. And it's really, there's a lot of basic steps. Anyone can be a well owner. I've certainly run across people who probably shouldn't be because they don't have interest, they don't seem to care or think it's a risk. And the bottom line is it's just doing your due diligence. And, it's a great water supply and you're taking care of it on your own. So, yeah, it's all about being aware. You need to sample your well. The bottom one's the main point. But also you should understand your log and where your water's coming from. If you have a screen or not, is it a bedrock well versus a sand and gravel well? All those things so that, one, when you do have an issue, you can ask better questions because you have some wherewithal that you've developed about your well. And so that's what we're all about. So that's what we have on our slide presentation. I'm going to, if I can, oh, there we go, pull up our questions, and it looks like we do have questions. So I'm going to make this full page and make it a little bigger. And we're just going to go ahead, as long as Katie and Dan are okay with that.
I'm great.
Sure.
Okay. So first question, okay, for the second question, Katie, will you put that on here? Will you just go ahead and add the Be Well Informed website?
Yep, I will.
So Are commercial places like schools or restaurants required to send their water samples to a stricter lab than what residential homeowners' requirements are? So there are no requirements for homeowners. There's no law that says you have to test for anything, either unless you're selling our home, or in the case of a new well that's being drilled. Many areas now have some sort of test that they want done. So that's either just coliform nitrate, or sometimes it might be arsenic, or nitrite and E. coli, a few things like that. So what's happening, if you're a commercial place like a school or restaurant, you're considered a non-community water supply. But if you have at least 25 employees, or you have more than 25 people a day that are drinking the water from your facility, or a school or restaurant, then you're considered either a transient or non-transient, non-community water supply, and you fall under the regulations of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So most schools, especially because of the lead issue and because so many schools are older, there's a lot of states that are passing laws that are requiring sampling in schools. And every state does that on their own, or has been. And I know Illinois just passed a law, and there's actually a webinar, it might have been last week, for schools to help them understand what the requirements are going to be. So you should talk to your primacy agency if you're a school or a restaurant and you are required to test, but certainly homeowners aren't required necessarily to test at all, like schools and restaurants would be, on a regular schedule, to make sure that the people they're serving, either their students or their customers, are getting safe water. And when you say stricter, the one thing I do want to mention I forgot to earlier, I know Dan, you and I talked about this earlier today, in some cases a certified lab may offer a basically, quote, a cheaper test for a well owner. So they're using a simpler method, or a method that's not as expensive for them to do in how they do the analysis. And so they'll give you a result for, say, some constituent, but it may not be using the EPA-approved method that they have to do for a community water supply. It's up to each person, but I would always find that out for sure. And if they offer a homeowner bundle that's cheaper than their regular bundle, if you will, I would ask the question, are these using the same EPA certified methods that you use for your community water supplies? And if not, I would ask them what it costs to do that, because that's what those labs have been certified acceptable in, are the ones that are they're EPA certified in. And there are different methods in some cases to find out the amount of a certain constituent in a water sample, and some aren't as accurate as others. So they're not a stricter lab, but they may have a cheaper way for you to go. In some cases, they could even be an assay type test where it's a presence-absence, and they can only tell you, yes, we know there's arsenic in the sample. Those don't do a lot for you. You're still going to have to go out and get another one to find out how high it is, because it certainly makes a difference if it's 5 versus 50, if you're concerned about the water quality in your well. Yeah. All right. So Katie's put that. Hopefully that answers your question. But now, all bets are off here in this part when it comes to sale of property. So, when a home's sold that has a well, for instance, in New Jersey, you're required by law to have the state lab come out and collect a water sample. And it used to be $600. I don't know if it still is, but they collect the sample. The buyer and the seller have to agree on who or how they're going to split the cost for that sample, and then both of them get the results. And so that everybody's aware of what the water quality is in the well. And, there's a number of jurisdictions that are doing that now. Some local health districts in some of the eastern states. I believe Oregon does that. There might be another one. And but that's, property sales are kind of a different animal. Okay, so I'm going to skip to the third one. I'll leave the second one up. You can see you can just Google NHDES and then Be Well Informed Guide, and I guarantee you that'll come up and get you there. So can a reverse osmosis system be used to soften water?
Well, you want me
Dan,
to
this is
try
all
to take
yours.
this, Steve? uh, the softening process is an ion exchange process where it switches out calcium and magnesium primarily, and a few other things, but they exist in the highest concentration generally. They switch out calcium and magnesium for sodium. It doesn't really remove the overall minerals. Some people will think you'll see some explanations of softeners that'll say, hey, it's taking out the minerals from your water, taking out the hardness minerals from your water. That part is true, but it doesn't really take them out completely. It just exchanges them for sodium and causes the less scaling ability, and the spots tend to be easier to remove. But the minerals still exist. The reverse osmosis system is actually taking the minerals out of the water, and you should generally see about a 90% removal or better of overall mineral content. So I guess in a way, yes, it does soften the water by taking a lot of stuff out. So if you did a calculation for your hardness, the calculation certainly would come out, or should come out, less after reverse osmosis. The one thing though, I mean, you can talk to your water treatment dealer, but I almost always see reverse osmosis systems put in after a softener because they say the hard water can cause fouling of the membrane or wear out the membrane faster. So if you do put it in with hard water and using it, you might check with your dealer. I guess another thing I should point out here, though, that most people use reverse osmosis systems as a point of use unit, not a whole house system. I guess you can buy one. We have a commercial one here in the laboratory, but these things waste a lot of water. They flush about 75% of the water down out to waste. So you would have it's just very unusual to have that on your whole house, and people will often want the soft water for their whole house. So softener is much more practical in that sense.
And you're looking at about 10 times cost difference too, and that's not wasted water. Yeah.
Yeah, the cost of just a single tap unit might be $200 if you put it in yourself, maybe a couple hundred more to have somebody put it in, versus maybe $5,000, or I haven't shopped for them, but recently I think we looked once and thought it was $5,000 or $6,000 for a large scale RO unit.
Yeah, it's not something that's typically done. That's for sure. Softener probably makes more sense economically, and
very easy to maintain a softener. Just add salt, probably a couple bags a month, or newer ones might even be less. It just depends on your situation.
Okay, so any thoughts on installing a rope to pull the pump versus pulling the pump by the drop pipe? I think there's more risk with a rope that over time, it's going to deteriorate faster rather than having a metal pipe. I would talk to a driller. I know there are some. I've certainly seen ropes. A lot of times, though, they're the safety rope, so to speak, not the drop pipe, obviously. You need the drop pipe is what the water's coming up through. So
I have a personal experience here, Steve.
All right, go right ahead.
I don't want to interrupt what you're saying. I on my well, I had a rope tied. It went down all 250 feet, and it was pretty interesting. I wondered, if it would disintegrate over time, but it didn't. It was a yellow nylon rope, and I think they put it back in, but I think the initial reason it was put in was because the drop pipe itself was a black flexible plastic, kind of a thin thing, and it was like Steve just mentioned, sort of a precautionary thing or a backup. I don't know what they would normally pull on, but I think it would normally, when they put it back in, they put in a more rigid PVC pipe. But I don't know what traditional code is or whatever. I just want to give that personal experience.
No, and I think it just depends on the type of drop pipe, because there's sometimes it's steel or galvanized drop pipe. But in like your case, if they're using black flexible hose, then you definitely want to pull it up by the rope.
Yeah, I think that was the gist.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean,
He
so
was
it's
afraid
done.
that.
I guess that's the bottom line. But if you have a solid drop pipe that, you know, is well secured to the pump, then like I said, a lot of times the rope is there because if maybe the water's corrosive or whatever, you know, the pipe has been in there for a really long time. You know, maybe it gets weak and you try to pull it up and it breaks, then you're going to lose your pump down the bottom of the well. And so the rope is there as a safety net, so to speak. So, yeah, I've installed a number of monitoring wells and drilled wells, monitoring wells, but I've never installed a pump. And so I would defer to some of the drillers that I work with. If you have a more specific instance that you're interested in, you just let us know. Are these systems effective against hard water? Electronic descaling system that is installed on the incoming water line going to the home that produces an oscillating electronic field using, you know, we'll have to look into that. It's not something I'm familiar with, and yeah, I've not heard of this before. So we can certainly look into it and talk to some, find out who might know, but I certainly don't have an answer for you today on the call. If you would email us, and so we can follow up. Okay, well, that's it. That's all the questions we have. I appreciate everybody's time. And with that, that's the end of the webinar. All right, if you have any further questions, just email us. Thank you for attending.